It was July 12, 2008, a sweltering summer afternoon in Guangxi, China. The nation was lost in the celebration of the Beijing Olympics, proud and united. But in a quiet rural town far from the stadium lights, a tragedy was quietly unfolding. A tragedy that no one would notice until it was far too late. Near the old Wei Bridge in Changjiang town, a group of curious bystanders crowded around what looked like a traffic accident. A man in his 40s lay lifeless on the roadside. Next to him, a red bicycle was flipped upside down as if it had skidded out of control. At first glance, it looked like just another unfortunate road mishap. But for the officers arriving on the scene, something felt off. There were no other vehicles in sight, no skid marks, no signs of a collision, and the man, he didn't have the kind of injuries you'd expect from an accident like this. No bleeding, no obvious trauma, just a still body and an eerily calm expression frozen on his face. When forensic officers arrived, their findings shook everyone. This man had not died from impact or injury. He had been poisoned with rodenticide. Someone had laced his body with death and dumped him here to make it look like an accident. His name was Zheng Maozhao, a factory worker husband and father of 2. He was not supposed to die like this. But who would want him dead? Why poison a seemingly ordinary man and stage a fake accident? And more chillingly, why did his wife disappear the very same day? I can't help but wonder, was this just a crime of passion or something far more disturbing, something no one in the town could have imagined? The story began to unravel slowly like a loose thread in a tightly woven fabric, each tug revealing something more frayed underneath. After the discovery of Zheng Maozhao's body, local police immediately launched an investigation. Through the motorcycle license plate, they confirmed the man's identity and notified his family. Zheng, a middle-aged man from a modest village in Guangxi, lived with his wife Wu Mofen and their 2 children. His extended family described him as quiet, hardworking, and kind. There were no enemies, no financial struggles, nothing to suggest anyone would want him dead. But there was one thing that didn't sit right. Wu Mofen, his wife, was nowhere to be found. When officers visited the home, it was his uncle, not his wife or parents, who showed up to the police station. According to the uncle, Wu had called after the incident to ask about how to handle the accident, but then abruptly hung up. Since then, no one had been able to reach her. And even more puzzling, Zheng's own parents hadn't come forward. They hadn't even shown signs of mourning. That's when suspicions began to shift. Police began tracing back the hours before Zheng's death. On the morning of July 12th, neighbors had seen Zheng leaving his home with Wu seated behind him on the motorcycle. They were heading out for work in Shunda district, a few towns over. Later that day, several eyewitnesses at the crash site reported seeing a woman around 30 years old trying to lift the man's body before suddenly collecting her handbag and walking away without calling for help. The description matched Wu Mofen. So the police asked themselves, why would a wife walk away from a dying husband? Was she in shock? Or was this something much more calculated? Over the next few days, police spoke with extended family friends and local neighbors. And slowly, they began hearing whispers, rumors, that something wasn't quite right in the Zheng household. 4 months prior, according to relatives, Wu had started spending more time away from home, saying she was looking for work. But in reality, she wasn't staying with friends, or even nearby. She was living in a rented room near her father-in-law's workplace. This detail stunned investigators. Why would a daughter-in-law choose to live near her father-in-law? And more importantly, why hadn't anyone mentioned this until now? The deeper they looked, the stranger things became. Zheng's father, Zheng Maoxi, worked as a security guard in a neighboring city. When questioned, he showed little emotion about his son's death. He claimed to rarely speak with Zheng and knew little about the incident. It struck investigators as cold, almost unnatural. But what really made the team pause was a casual comment from the uncle. Wu Mofen had taken care of Maoxi while he was injured months earlier, and she had stayed with him for over a week. That detail triggered an uncomfortable theory among the detectives. Could there have been something inappropriate between Wu and her father-in-law? They approached colleagues at Zheng Maoxi's workplace and asked discreet questions. What they heard next shifted the case entirely. Every time Wu visited the job site, Mao Shi would volunteer to cover extra shifts, especially night shifts, so that no one else would be around. Some co-workers suspected an affair but kept quiet. After all, it wasn't their business, and the couple had been careful not to cross visible lines. But now, with Zheng dead and Wu missing, this wasn't just family drama. It was starting to look like a motive. On July 26th, police formally opened an investigation into both Wu Mofen and Zheng Maoshi. Surveillance teams followed leads, combed through mobile data, and tracked financial activity. Weeks passed with no solid break, and then finally a call came in. It was Wu Mofen. She called the police herself. She wanted to speak with the lead investigator, and what she said changed everything.
It had been over a month since Zheng Maozhao's death. His wife Wu Mofen had disappeared without a trace. Investigators feared the worst, but they also suspected she might be hiding in plain sight. Then one October evening, a surprising breakthrough.
The lead investigator at the Guangxi Public Security Bureau received a call. The woman on the other end identified herself as Wu Mofen. Her voice was calm, eerily calm. She asked to speak directly with the officer handling her husband's case. Her message was short but devastating. She confessed.
I poisoned Zheng, she said, but it had nothing to do with my father-in-law. Please stop investigating him.
And just like that, she hung up. The team froze. Why would someone vanish only to return with a confession, and one that deflected attention away from another suspect? Was she trying to protect someone or manipulate the narrative? That question lingered for weeks.
Then, on October 29th, Wu called again. This time, her tone was different. Nervous, hesitant. She revealed her location, Simakiao in Hunan province, and asked a haunting question. Will I be sentenced to death if I turn myself in?
Police immediately alerted authorities in Hunan. That same night, Wu Mofen was taken into custody without resistance. She offered no struggle, no panic, just silence. Back in Guangxi, the investigative team knew they were now holding the prime suspect, but they still didn't have the full story. Why had she done it? What drove a wife and mother to murder not just her husband, but possibly even her mother-in-law?
The interrogation began.
At first, Wu said little. Her answers were clipped, detached. Officers noted that she showed no remorse, no acknowledgement of the gravity of what she'd done. But gradually, with careful psychological guidance and patient questioning, the story began to unfold. Wu Mofen was born in a remote village in the Guangxi Autonomous Region. Her upbringing, she claimed, had been steeped in hardship. Her parents both blind-viewed her as a burden and prioritized their sons, food, attention, and even education. These were luxuries reserved for her brothers. Wu was pulled from school before she could finish primary education, forced into backbreaking labor by the age of 10. She was, in her words, the invisible daughter. By the time she was 20, her family arranged her marriage to Zheng Maozhao. He was a quiet, obedient man, the only son in a matriarchal household. His mother ruled the home, and Zheng followed her word in everything. Wu described the years that followed as a second prison. Her husband lacked initiative. Her mother-in-law was controlling. Every decision, even the smallest, was dictated to her. She was a ghost in her own life once again.
But it wasn't until her father-in-law, Zheng Maoshi, returned home from work one New Year's Eve that something began to change.
He treated her with kindness, bought her a small gift, not expensive but thoughtful. He noticed when she was hurting, encouraged his wife and son to apologize when they'd wronged her. For the first time, Wu Mofen felt seen.
That attention, that warmth, it ignited something in her that had been buried for decades.
Over time, she began to interpret his kindness as something more, and soon she acted on it. According to her, the first real turning point came when Zheng Maoshi suffered a work injury and needed someone to care for him. His wife refused to travel. Wu volunteered, and in that cramped dormitory space, something unspeakable happened. They crossed a line. Whether it was mutual or one-sided, whether it began as manipulation or yearning, it was a moment neither of them could take back, and it was the beginning of everything that followed. From there, the investigation took a darker turn. Phone records confirmed hours-long conversations between the 2 dozens of them, often late at night. Surveillance at Maoxi's workplace revealed a pattern of behavior that was no longer deniable. The police now had their motive. What they didn't have yet was the full extent of the damage left behind. By now, the pieces were starting to fit together, but what they revealed was not just a case of infidelity or betrayal. It was a haunting portrait of obsession delusion and ultimately destruction. Wu Mofen's relationship with her father-in-law Zheng Maoxi had spanned nearly 4 years. Secret, calculated, and as far as she was concerned, romantic. But the investigators saw it differently. They saw a dynamic built not on love but on emotional dependency, repression, and silent desperation. In official interviews, Zheng Maoxi initially denied everything. He claimed Wu misunderstood his kindness, that he treated her with respect simply because he knew his wife had been hard on her. But under mounting evidence and quiet pressure, he began to break. He admitted that the two had shared an inappropriate closeness. He confessed to helping Wu avoid suspicion after her husband's death. He never poisoned anyone, he insisted, but he did keep her secret. He didn't report her. He didn't stop her. Legally speaking, this was enough to charge him not with murder, but with obstruction of justice. Still, neither Wu nor Maoxi publicly admitted to a consensual affair. It was always framed as emotional, circumstantial, or one-sided. Investigators, however, had uncovered intimate messages, frequent phone calls, and even eyewitness reports that painted a more complicated picture. As more details emerged, the role of each family member took on chilling clarity. Zheng Maozhao, the husband, was by all accounts a gentle, passive man. He was deeply loyal to his mother, obedient to the point of self-neglect. When he fell ill shortly before his death, he asked Wu to get him medicine. She did, but she tampered with it, filled the capsules with poison. That same afternoon, she convinced him to take her on a short motorcycle trip. He was visibly weak, but he went anyway.
Not far from their village, the poison began to take effect.
As Zheng lost control of the bike, Wu leapt off. He crashed into a roadside barrier and died shortly after hitting the ground. Then she calmly picked up her purse and walked away. Investigators also unearthed a second crime, the unexplained disappearance of Zheng's mother, Maoxi's wife. She hadn't been seen for weeks. Her last known location, a rented apartment in Guangxi where Wu Mofen had taken her to relax. Wu claimed she wanted to console her mother-in-law after Zheng Maozhao's death.
The truth was far more sinister.
A post-mortem examination revealed the woman had ingested the same poison used to kill her son. Investigators believe Wu laced her tea with rodenticide, served it with care, and watched as the woman she loathed slipped into silence. That made 2 deaths, 2 quiet exits, 2 people who stood in the way of her fantasy, a future with Zheng Maoxi. But the plan, if there ever truly was one, had unraveled fast. When neighbors started whispering about how close Wu and Maoxi had become, the family matriarch grew suspicious. At a dinner one night, she reportedly separated the dining tables, one for her and her husband, another for Wu and her husband. It was a silent message, I know.
In response, Wu grew more withdrawn and more determined.
Witnesses later told police that Wu often stared at Maoxi with quiet intensity. At first, it seemed like admiration. Later, it seemed like obsession. Still, the legal system had to be careful. There was no evidence of a murder pact. No indication that Zheng Maoxi had conspired to kill his wife or son. His crime was omission, knowing something was terribly wrong and choosing silence. Was he scared, manipulated, or was he too emotionally entangled to act?
Some say he loved her. Others believe he was simply too ashamed to admit he didn't.
Even now, I can't help but wonder, was it truly love? Or was it a longing for recognition from someone who finally saw him not as a husband or a father, but as a man?
Whatever it was, it cost lives, and it would soon cost them both their freedom.
When Wu Mofen stood before the court, she looked composed, almost serene. There were no tears, no dramatic outbursts, just a calm gaze that met the judge's eyes as if she had already accepted her fate. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, locals, and family members filled the benches, their expressions a mix of outrage, disbelief, and morbid curiosity. The story had captivated public attention not just because of the murders, but because of the twisted human drama behind them.
Wu was charged with 2 counts of intentional homicide, the premeditated murders of her husband Zheng Maozhao and her mother-in-law. Prosecutors laid out the timeline with chilling precision: the poisoning, the manipulation, the cover-up. They presented forensic evidence call records, witness statements, and most damning of all, Wu's own confessions during police interrogation.
In her defense, Wu's attorney did not deny her actions. Instead, they attempted to shift the narrative. She was a victim of lifelong emotional abuse, they argued. A woman molded by neglect, trapped in a cold marriage dismissed by those around her. She sought love where she found it, even if it was forbidden. But the court was unconvinced. Whatever pain she had endured did not justify murder, and even more disturbingly, her complete lack of remorse was impossible to ignore. Psychological assessments presented during trial described Wu as emotionally detached and narcissistic, with a heightened need for control and affirmation. The experts stopped short of declaring her mentally unfit, but they painted a profile of someone capable of calculating decisions even in matters of life and death. Her motive, the court concluded, was not love, it was desire. A toxic, self-centered obsession disguised as romance. Zheng Maoxi, the father-in-law, was tried separately. He faced charges of obstruction of justice and aiding a criminal after the fact. While he maintained he had no knowledge of Wu's plan to kill his wife and son, the evidence painted a different picture. His silence in the aftermath, his failure to alert authorities, his willingness to cover for Wu, these were not the actions of an innocent bystander. The court acknowledged that he did not participate in the murders themselves, but his refusal to intervene contributed to the tragedy. He was sentenced to several years in prison, with the understanding that his role, though passive, was deeply consequential.
As the verdict was read, Wu Mofen remained unmoved. She showed no sign of regret, no apology, just a faint nod as if the sentence was merely a formality.
She was given the harshest penalty allowed under Chinese criminal law, death. Many in the courtroom agreed it was just. Others whispered that perhaps her life had been over long before the crimes, that somewhere between a neglected childhood, a loveless marriage, and an affair that could never be, she had already crossed a line she could never return from. But there were no victors in this case, only victims. 2 lives lost, a family shattered, and worst of all, 2 young children left behind in the wreckage. Some people say justice was served. Others say no sentence can ever make sense of such a twisted love. And as I watched this unfold, I couldn't help but ask, did she truly think this would give her happiness? Or was it never about love at all, but the illusion of control in a world where she had none? The court sentences were handed down. The headlines faded, but the wounds this story left behind, those didn't heal so easily. Zheng Maozhao and his mother both gone in the blink of an eye. Their deaths were not just violent, they were intimate betrayals, carried out not by strangers or enemies, but by someone who once shared their meals, their home, their trust.
And what remained?
2 children, orphans, too young to understand the full weight of what happened, yet old enough to feel the absence, old enough to remember their father's quiet kindness, their grandmother's stern gaze, and the growing silence that began to fill their home in the weeks before it all fell apart. They were the true innocents in this story, left behind not just by death, but by the shame of what their mother had done. There's something profoundly unsettling about crimes like this, not because of the violence alone, but because of where they happen. Not in dark alleys or faraway hotels, but in kitchens, in bedrooms, in living rooms where family photos hang on the walls. The home becomes the crime scene,
And it makes you wonder, how many people live with unspoken resentment? How many tragedies begin with a single overlooked sigh, a dismissed cry for help, a moment of loneliness ignored?
Wu Mofen's case is in the end not just about murder, it's about human need, about what happens when the ache for love, for power, for validation turns into something darker, something that consumes logic, compassion, and life itself. Some viewers may ask, could this have been prevented? Maybe if someone had noticed earlier, maybe if Wu had received the help she needed, maybe if Zheng Maoxi had said no sooner, maybe. But that's the haunting part of stories like this. They don't begin with poison, they begin with silence.
And in that silence, people drift away from who they were, from the families they built, from the choices they could have made.
Today, Wu Mofen awaits the ultimate punishment. Zheng Maoshi, the man she claimed to love, sits in prison, and 2 children grow up knowing their lives were ripped apart by a secret too heavy for any family to bear. You might think this story is an outlier and extreme, but sometimes extreme outcomes are the result of very ordinary beginnings. A feeling of being unseen, a marriage slowly losing its spark, a person desperate to matter to someone, anyone.
There are no heroes here, only consequences.
And so we're left with questions. Could love have saved her?
Could accountability have saved them?
Or was this tragedy written the moment kindness was mistaken for something it was never meant to be? You tell me. What do you think truly drove Wu Mofen to commit these acts? Was it love, revenge, or something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this case left you thinking, subscribe for more true crime stories that go beyond the headlines. Stories that ask what drives people to cross the line. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.